Ladies and gentlemen, I am very pleased with this first event taking place in the context of EU Sustainable Energy Week. And I am particularly pleased to see this event dedicated to the role and the place of architects in the clean energy transition. Because, first of all, the architects are a fundamental profession. A fundamental profession both for the whole economy, but also for the daily life of our citizens, of all Europeans. For the whole economy, because as you know very well, last year the construction sector has represented around 8.6% of European GDP. 8.6%. The construction sector is representing 18 million of jobs in Europe. And the architect market in Europe is estimated at around 13.5 billion euros. And we have, as you know, around more than 500,000 architects in Europe. They are representing a lot. And this profession is also fundamental for the daily life of our citizens. Not only in terms of saving on their bills, on their energy bills, but also for their contribution for increasing the comfort of life of our citizens. And this is the case when we are reflecting on residential building, but also public building, schools, universities, hospitals, but also social housing. At a time we should also eradicate or contribute to eradicate energy precarity in different member states. Because energy precarity is not compatible at all with European social model. Accordingly, we should eradicate as rapidly as possible this situation in all our member states. And as you know, for that, the renovation of social housing is a must. And this should become a priority for the different governments, but also at all levels. Not only for national government, but also regional government and cities. And in addition, the energy transition is contributing a lot to the development of energy efficiency and the penetration of renewable energy in building. And we all know that the energy used in buildings is one of the major challenges in the European Union. The buildings are representing at least 40% of global energy consumption. But if I would like to add also heating and cooling, this is largely beyond 40%. And as you know, the present situation is characterized by inefficient building and very old and inefficient heating and cooling system. Accordingly, we have a sort of obligation to shift into the direction of modernization. Modernization of building, modernization of heating and cooling system. And this will facilitate decarbonization. We cannot isolate decarbonization. Decarbonization should be cost efficient and more rapidly managed in the context of modernization. And I consider extremely important to increase significantly the sensibilization of architects. sometimes I have the impression it is not the case, still the case. We have some exception, as you are, because I had the opportunity to visit also Foster in London 2 or 3 years ago, with the capacity to see your real level of preparation to tackle this new priority. But as you know, it is not the case with all architects. And the result is that we are not implementing well the best technologies at the occasion of, in particular, renovation of building. In general, for new building, it is the case. But it is not yet the case anytime we are confronted to renovation. And the real target is that of renovation of existing building, because, as you know, we have quasi 80% of our building still inefficient. And at that time, we should integrate all aspects, not only passive, I can say, aspect, I mean insulation of roof, of walls, of window, but also active renovation. I mean incorporation in this new approach of new technologies for everything. And I repeat, it is not yet the case. Look the situation with lighting. The technologies are there, completely mature, for regulating the intensity of light, increasing the comfort and reducing energy consumption at the same time. But nevertheless, 90% now are still implementing old technologies and not new technologies. And it is the particular role of architects to increase the sensibilization through their project of all, in particular, SMEs. And this will contribute a lot to our priorities. We are not priorities for European institutions. We are priorities in order to facilitate the development of the whole European economy, but also this should be profitable for Europeans, for individuals. Anytime you are confronted to renovation of big building or residential building for individuals. This is absolutely important. And let me say, we will facilitate that, putting in place in Europe the most advanced legal framework. We are participating to different fora at international level. I see many declarations regarding investment in this area or another area, renewables, but many times with no vision in terms of the place and the role of regulatory framework. The regulatory framework is the precondition for attracting investment and for accelerating all aspects we are discussing now. We have presented for that the new Clean Energy for All European package. And I am very pleased to see that last month we had the first directive adopted with a very large support of member states, and a very large support from the European Parliament, from all political groups. We had only 35 votes against, 35. And a lot, more than 550 votes for. And let me say, this performance building directive will be important in order to accelerate the renovation rate of building. In order also to facilitate the integration through renovation of automation control system in order to regulate heating and cooling, and to regulate through smart thermostat per floor and per room. This is fundamental. And let me say, in that case, the return to investment is not rapid, but extremely rapid. Accordingly, it's important that architects will be in situation to integrate completely all this new provision of reference European legislation. European legislation should become reference point in the day-to-day work also of architects. Doing that, you will become a sort of pioneer of energy transition in the large context of renovation of building. Let me say also that we had the opportunity to revisit the energy performance contract together with Eurostat. And the change we manage will make it easier for public authorities to go also in that direction. And this is also important anytime we are thinking about renovation of public buildings. I mentioned already universities, schools, hospitals. And as you know, we are all in situation to also implement all these things. And many times we have also this feeling in this public building, we are in very old building, with no insulation, with no modern equipment. Let me say, I refer previously to the crucial importance for our economy of construction sector. But behind the construction sector, we have also steel industry. And we have also engineering industries. Engineering industries are representing 11 million of jobs in Europe. Donc pushing, accelerating the renovation of building will also boost in Europe economic development. And this morning we had also the opportunity to insist on the particular role of cities, including your city, Angela, Firenze, but all cities in general, for facilitating this shift, because they are closer to citizens and in situation to develop even more the renovation of building as well as the development of clean transport. But again, we need more bridge, new link between architect and European institutions, national government, but also regional government and cities, individual mayors, in order to organize the things adequately. It is not possible to remain only with some emblematic cities in some area in the world, in Abu Dhabi. It's not sufficient. We have to develop that at large scale in Europe. And we have a vocation in Europe to become the world leader for energy transition, mixing the most advanced regulatory framework, the most advanced provision in European legislation, including for supporting a new role for consumers, European consumers, but also in order to give credibility to our role in the context of the COP. We will have a new COP24 in Europe after Paris, after Marrakesh and Bonn. Bonn was organized in Europe because of a lack of logistics for Fiji. But this year, in December, we will have one of the most important COP after Paris in order to be in situation to really assess the progress made and the additional new progress required. We will present just before a new long-term decarbonization strategy, addressing all the challenges, not only for the energy sector, of course, power sector, but also building, but also industry, but also transport and mobility, but also agriculture. And you can see we will never be successful without the contribution, the participation, active participation of all key actors. And my opinion is very clear. The architects have an eminent place and role to play in that context, because you are the first at the origin of any plan for new building, of a big renovation of building. And it is extremely important to pay attention of all aspects I mentioned before. Not only regarding passive insulation, but also active measures in order to integrate all the now available new technologies dedicated to all aspects in a building. Accordingly, the design is important, but also the quality of materials. We need also creativity. We had a long period without, we should confess that without any creativity in the context of architect, with the same design, uniformity, etc., etc. It is time to pass to more creativity, but to more capacity to integrate all aspects of new technologies. And doing that, this will be profitable for all territories, for all cities. This will boost economic development, will create solid jobs, in particular in SMEs, and this will be profitable for all Europeans. And accordingly, I would like to invite you, all the architects, to go in that direction, and you can count on our support, of the support of the European Commission. Thank you very much. I wish you full success. I have now to shift directly to the European Parliament, because as you know, we are in a phase of preparing the finalization of important additional legislation dedicated to energy efficiency, to renewables. We will have 2 new trilogues next week, Paula, and accordingly, it is time to finalize that positively. But I wish to you full success, very profitable dialogue, and we will prolong that during a long period in order to make you to make a success in terms of cooperation and development of partnership with architects. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dominique. So, thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Paolo Frankel. I'm the head of the Renewable Energy Division at the International Energy Agency, and it's my honor and pleasure to moderate these presentations and this discussion. It's a pleasure for 2 reasons. One is work is professional. Energy and renewables are my daily life. We don't do enough at all on cities. The potential is huge, but we have not even started. The second is personal. I'm a physicist by background, but I come from a family of architects. My father, my grandfather, so I'm particularly curious and keen on hearing your vision. I would go directly to the presentations. Please, if you can, limit to 15 minutes each, because I would like to have some time for the discussions, even less. If the more concise, the better. So the first speaker is David Nelson, who is a partner at Foster Architects. David, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Where's the flipper there? Is that it? Yeah. Good afternoon. I usually like to start these things by making it very clear that I'm standing here representing a large number of people who have done most of this work. I'm the spokesman for that rather than the author of everything you're going to see. A little journey that we went on back in November of 2016. We prepared this document here for the UN. And presented it at the COP22 in Marrakesh. It's a visual interpretation of what the Paris Agreement agreed. The document itself is quite complex and difficult to decipher, particularly for people like architects who are very visual. So we prepared this as a visual translation. Obviously, the key message that comes out of it is this. We're trying to keep the temperature from rising below 2 degrees, and ideally 1.5. And we felt that how does that translate into our world, our everyday world, an everyday world indeed for most architects. Around the world, sustainability issues are really monitored and measured, if you like, in different ways. There are more than, well over 200 different systems for measuring energy, materials, and all those things all over the world. So we devised a while ago this tiering system here. So along the bottom there, there's LEED and BREEAM, and then there's the system from Qatar, the China Green Building label, and many, many others that go through. And we found that by creating tiers, tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, we could bring all of those different ways of measuring together so we could compare project to project so that we could actually have a greater understanding. And clearly they're all different in themselves, dependent on location, but we found there were these commonalities through here. We decided, and again as we work around the world, not everybody's as interested in the subject of sustainability as some of us might be. So we have to, where do we pitch it? So we took, about 5 years ago, tier 2. Now tier 2 is the equivalent to LEED Gold, if you know LEED, and tier 1 is clearly platinum, the highest that you can go with that. And through looking and understanding the Paris Agreement, we realized that if every building in the world was LEED platinum, we'd still have a problem. But we could never actually understand or get any more information. So we embarked on a series of exercises in working and collaborating with others to actually put the mathematics together for that. And what you realize is that with the Paris Agreement challenge, we actually are going to need 2 new tiers, tier 0 and tier -1 in our office. But it means, as you can see, we have to go way beyond the highest levels that the world's measuring systems offer today. And therefore, and this is in a little bit more detail, just shows you we've already risen by 1 degree, as many of you know, the 2 degree and the 1.5 Paris. And obviously up here, tier 3 and, tier 4, good day, tier 2, tier 1. And here's the difference between all of those systems that we currently work with today. Cities work with them, clients work with them, and it's not good enough. So we have this mismatch between the two, and that really is the challenge for all of us. And in the agreement, there is if you take the full deck of cards, hence the deck of cards here, and put it across all the different industries in the world that have to comply with this, and actually by 2050 reduced by about 50%. You can see in these different sectors, industry, power, buildings, agriculture, everybody's been challenged. Nobody's giving any answers in this document. The challenge is there. What are we all going to do? So what are we all going to do in those different disciplines, really, as it moves? Ours, the built environment, if you like, takes some of those and brings them together. Our cards are a smaller deck, but nevertheless, this is what we actually will have to work with to bring about. I think that most of you who are architects and engineers will know that the use of energy, and therefore the creation of carbon that creates the problems, in terms of architecture, it comes in 2 forms. One, it's in operational emissions, which is that when your building's finished and you're running it, all the power and all the deliveries and everything else that go forward thereafter are called operational emissions. And the other side of the coin is embodied emissions, which is the stuff that goes, all the energy that goes into the materials, the transportation, the construction, all those things come together in the same story. Now, you can achieve LEED Platinum and BREEAM Excellence just on the operational emissions, because none of those classification systems yet bring you really seriously into embodied energy. But Paris will change the game for all that, and therefore architects and everybody, contractors, everybody involved with our world and all those other worlds will have to start to actually look at this in far greater detail. Some are already on the case, some have done different work, some are very knowledgeable. Most architects don't even get it. And why should they? Because the regulatory systems that we actually all have don't even call for it. So, what can we do? On the operational side, the first message is how can we reduce consumption? How can we, with our buildings that's complete, what can we do technically in order to actually bring about that change? Well, one of them obviously is to do with the performance of the building, whether it's solar shading here, or other ways that we can reduce the running costs of a building by considering natural ventilation. And this project for Bloomberg in the centre of London is a very deep planned floors. And most people, particularly in Europe, mainland Europe, will think about the fact that shallow plan is very good for opening the windows, but the way work is and the way people are going in terms of work, we need deeper and deeper spaces. So this is very unusually deep. And then how can you naturally ventilate across there? Well, you have to do a lot of work, a lot of development work. There's some of the sort of testing rigs that we produced to allow and think about how we could bring fresh air from outside into the space through these louvers here on the outside. And also, how can we test it? You can do all the computer simulations, but in the end, you have to find ways of proving that this is going to work. Your client can't be a guinea pig. It has to actually operate. So here, this is tank testing using a method of injecting ink, and the whole model is underwater, and it will give you an idea about how the air will move around the space and at what speed. And new technologies and new opportunities are around. The wonderful invention of LED, which finally broke the back of all the fluorescent tubes about 5, 6 years ago, gave us an opportunity to rethink how you might incorporate LEDs into lighting systems in offices to run them more efficiently. They do produce a lot of heat, so you have to cool them. So here we're combining the light fittings, the LEDs, with water to take away the heat from the LEDs and also help cool the space. So that kind of transformation is possible, but you really have to do a lot more of it. But here in the final system, with the ceiling system here installed and operationally, and that's what it is. All of this, because there's no power generated in the building very much, there are a few photovoltaics on the roof, but not much, has to be offset. And at the present point in history, it means Bloomberg has either got to go out and buy a field full of photovoltaics or buy their energy in a green way. And that is what we have to do in the middle of our cities. In other contexts, like this in California with Apple, we're able to incorporate a huge amount of LED over the roof of the main building and also the car parking, and could get it together with fuel cells and batteries and a small amount of biofuel coming in to keep it up. They can generally, in operational terms, be carbon neutral. And this is the way that it goes. And similarly, how can you reduce the load? So the natural ventilation comes in. Now, many years ago when we did Masdar, we actually discovered that if you work at a bigger scale than architecture, you go for urban planning, then you can actually affect more of the demands on carbon in particular, but also all the other issues like water and food. You can actually address them in a way that you cannot do within the confines of one building. So we've been pushing very hard into that world, looking at what we might do. And it's interesting that sometimes projects come along that don't really seem like they're likely to be able to offer anything. But this one came along. This is in Hainan. It's an island, a man-made island off Hainan, which is meant to be a place for fun, for people to be entertained when they go. But it came with a desire to actually incorporate whatever technologies were there today. Could this be an example of what you might need to do if you plan cities in the future? And as you see, very strange for us in Europe to see a blank canvas. There's nothing there, so it forces you, forces the team, the group that collaborate together, to think of everything at the same time. And there are no constraints. There's no 19th century planning, medieval planning. There is nothing. So you can think of fundamental propositions in terms of infrastructure because there's nothing there. And this, we think, will give an incredible level of integration and higher performance and higher efficiencies by actually planning it and thinking about it all at once. There's an awful lot talked about in conferences with smart cities about what you can do with this. You can get everything back in your phone, and that seems to be a big emphasis in those sessions. And actually, the real smart city lies in all of this stuff, the whole of the infrastructure. A very difficult challenge when we look back at our cities like this one. But nevertheless, maybe there's an opportunity, maybe we will learn things from being in this more pure state to be able to do it. I call it simultaneous complexity because this just takes out the kind of energy part of that layering system through there. And you realize that into itself, there's technologies on technologies on technologies. How's the power generated? Where does it come from? What's the standby position? All those issues have got to be thought about at the same time as water, waste management, deliveries, goods. And what's emerging with the design here, as you can see, this is above ground and below ground to the bottom part of the picture, robotic deliveries for all the goods. You can think of things because there's no constraints. So if you can bring it all together, it's a fantastic opportunity. It's still not big enough. This is the same size as Masdar. But the knowledge that we want to try and get on here should be applicable. And when an opportunity comes along, we'll be able to apply a lot of the knowledge and thinking to that bigger scale. This is what it'd be like above ground. There's also trying to bring things like the way food is grown in cities. It's something that we've incorporated now into master planning quite a bit. How do you grow food in the city? What do you grow? You know, what should it be like? And can people have a closer connection with all that kind of activity? And then something else comes along. Maybe, I think somebody said once, success is where preparation meets opportunity. This is the opportunity. This is Amravati. This is a new city in India that we're working on. And it really is a city scale. You can see here compared with some places that you know of. We're currently developing the central strip, the more civic part, the government buildings, and all of the kind of agencies and things that will be associated with that. But it is part of a bigger scale plan, of which there is great opportunity to continue. And in things like the way that those layering issues we've talked about, that's all happening now. This is very much in the design stage. So that's coming in and trying to balance and include all of these different factors within that overall plan. And if we were trying to offset with that, we're trying to think about, well, how much power would be needed? In addition to the power all over the roofs, we'd have to have these extra ones, embodied carbon, operational carbon. That's the sort of physical scale of power generation you need for a city, which looks like this. So this is our best shot at the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. So I would suggest we go immediately to the second presentation from Rainer de Graaf from OMA. I had a very interesting title in your program, in the program, saying megalopolitics. I'm not sure you're keeping this topic or not. Anyway, the floor is yours.
Okay.
Whatever you say.
Thank you. Well, be careful what you wish for when you say that. This is as close as I will get to showing a building in the context of this presentation. This is also the last time our office, OMA, was in Brussels. This is our only realized project in the city. On the upside, it is for the European Union. On the downside, it is a circus tent. It is composed of all colors of the flags of European nation, and in it was an exhibition about the history of the EU, shown at a time that one could still show the history of the EU with a certain amount of pride. It is meanwhile 15 years old, this project. But anyway, having said that, that's not what I'm here to talk about. The subject of the meeting, the architect's contribution to the clean energy transition. And architects have a kind of habitual reflex when they deal with energy and climate stuff. It's modest buildings, green walls, green roofs, and it always strikes me somehow the self-imposed modesty in relation to the size of the issue that we're facing. And particularly I'm interested in the contrast that existed between what architects thought 50 years ago. This is Buckminster Fuller, a project called Spaceship Earth. It's essentially the spaceship is a metaphor for an Earth with a finite amount of resources that once finished cannot be refueled, and that is game over. And I think since that project, we've become subject to a remarkable paradox. Yes, there is an enormous sustainability awareness, but the more we become aware, the smaller the scale of our interventions, to the point that the combined sort of interventions look something like this. And I know that when you do enough small bits, that in the end they will amount to a big bit. But we've always wondered in the context whether, you know, design doesn't merit to be implied on a much larger scale. So the project that I would like to show one project, and that's a project which is meanwhile, well, nearly 10 years old. It was a project we did for the European Climate Foundation, commissioned at a time that Europe was also stronger, more popular, and a more believable construct than it is from day to day at the moment. And this was a project for a European energy grid. This was shortly after COP15. That was at a time that actually world leaders spoke to each other, not always with a terrific result, but at least they talked to each other. And it's quite interesting. This is just COP15. The larger the smile, the bigger the contribution to CO2 emission. And that is in itself an interesting thing. So therefore, it's probably not a surprise that that party didn't end particularly well. But that doesn't invalidate the issues, of course, that was talked about. This is the emissions statistically of those countries, of the leaders in the picture. This is what those emissions would become if they would follow the example of the world leader. I mean, the world leader in CO2 emission per capita being the United States, clearly an escalation of emission. And we know, meanwhile, that the United States no longer leads by example in this matter. The United States leadership does not believe in global warming, despite, of course, evidence of the contrary. It has sort of its own statistics to substantiate its position. This is an example, the Rasmussen report poll to substantiate the position of the United States government. Do scientists falsify research to support their own theory on global warming? Somewhat likely, 59% very likely, 35, 27 not very likely. But if you add up the numbers, it itself is a form of hyperbole, because they add up to 120%. In other words, it doesn't add up. Nevertheless, that is the position, and I'm sorry that the European Commission left the building, but this is at least interesting. Anyway, there is, of course, evidence, and the weather circumstances are the evidence in themselves. Climate anomalies and events in 2007, the escalating cost related to dealing with that, a massive impact on the global economy. So Europe in that condition is an interesting construct. Europe, this is a summary of the headlines as we found them when we started the project. Of course, a very impressive effort, but an effort that predominantly takes place at a national scale. So Germany pursues sun, Sicily, for some odd reason, pursues wind. Everybody happily pursues their own thing. The premise of this project was what would happen if Europe really, really came together on the issue of energy. What are the advantages that could be achieved if there were truly a Europe-wide energy approach? It's a very simple story. There is sun in the south, there is wind in the north. There isn't rocket science. But if, in a way, there isn't always sun in the south and there isn't always wind in the north, but if you could connect the two, there might be sun in the south when there isn't wind in the north, there might be wind in the north when there isn't sun in the south. And one of the main drawbacks of renewable energy, namely the volatility of the weather, could be mediated. And of course, it isn't just sun and wind that we're talking about. Europe is essentially a tapestry of very different geographical and climatic conditions, suitable for different type of renewable energy, as is solar, wind, tidal, biomass, geothermal. It all exists on this relatively small continent, to the point that if you look at all of these and you superimpose them, that a very interesting vision of Europe can come about. Not a European necessarily of individual and independent member state, but a Europe of mutually complementary energy reasons, which all specialize in a particular sort of energy, so they don't have to do everything, and which altogether offer a complete picture. So we have Solaria, Hydropia, the tidal states, the carbon capture storage republic, as a sort of joke of bad taste in Poland, and the sum total was called Aneuropa. In other words, a vision of Europe, a political vision of Europe in which the individual member states, in a way, specialized in different forms of energy, almost like a team with different roles of a team, and where Europe would engage emphatically when it came to energy, not in a declaration of independence, but in a declaration of interdependence. That was the particular take we had. So how does this work? I too have to say that even we as an architecture office did not do this on our own. Today I'm the spokesman not only of the architects practice, but a number of scientists and banks and a conglomerate of organizations that together worked on the case for this, which in a way that I guess admittedly eludes my technical comprehension, transformed the existing European energy network via the introduction of a number of expressways, energy expressways, which linked the energy systems of the countries together. The energy systems are currently linked via a sort of an emergency system, kind of a back door. This relied on turning the back door into a front door. Then different subgrids, and then different subgrids linked to different forms of renewable energy. Almost that you could read Europe as a roadmap, or in this case, an underground map of different energy links, truly integrated energy infrastructure on the size of a continent. That would mean, and calculations of that showed, that essentially energy consumption could continue to rise, but that the relative share of fossil fuel in the energy provision would steadily go down. It would also mean that by 2050, European emissions could be reduced by about 80%. And as part of this study, we also looked at the remaining 20%, which in a way came from expanding that same system of exchange to North Africa, which would then be more of an exchange than just sun and wind, but which also would lead to new jobs, technological innovation, and benefit both sides considerably. This is the Mediterranean reduced to the size of the Seine as a thing. So anyway, it would allow Africa to capitalize on its most predominant energy source, namely heat. A rough calculation of doing that has very interesting implications, that the amount of energy that can be generated like that surpasses the total amount of energy that can be generated from available oil reserves in the Middle East, which of course does not only have technical implications, it has huge political implications. Europe is an emphatically democratic continent, which ironically is highly dependent on less democratic parts of the world for its energy provision. But we did an extension of this project later to Russia. And this is, of course, the caricature that exists about Russia when it comes to European energy, that all they need to do is turn off the tap and they happily strangle us. That story is significantly more nuanced. It can be doubted whether the continued reliance of Russia on fossil fuel is actually in the interest of Russia. One has to go ever deeper into the country. Their oil reserves are getting depleted to the point that they have to go to very unfeasible regions of the country to actually extract oil. Russia has a huge energy problem itself. Russia, as you know, is big, but its population lives on essentially 1% of its territory to the west, which means that the place where the energy is consumed in Russia, vis-a-vis where the energy is generated, increasingly further away, that therefore energy in the context of Russia travels massive distances, way bigger distances than the distance between Germany or France or even Spain and Poland, and that there is a net surplus and a net deficit, which have to be linked at an ever greater distance, which means there are already remote regions deprived of energy. There's a very complicated system of transporting energy, and in typical Russian fashion, the system looks like this. So you can sort of imagine what amount of the energy generated, how much of it is left by the time it reaches the populated area. So anyway, we did a similar, not to kind of bore you to death, but we did a similar thing for Russia, where we looked at local energy provisions, partly wind and partially biomass as a particular suitability, as an off-grid energy to essentially provide it. There's about 10 million people who don't have energy to spend. The Dachas, which are also not connected to the grid, I'm nearly done, could be provided like that, but in a way to start with the part of Russia that isn't on the energy grid as a way to transform its policy. Russia could then become an energy exporter. All of this is, of course, highly utopian, as you can tell from this image. Propaganda for renewable energy. And of course, it's a far-fetched thing from the truth, even further utopian than I think our European project in the light of Russian policies today, which go into the Arctic. And I think there's to conclude, a kind of wonderful irony in that. The Arctic Ring, again, played a crucial role in Buckminster Fuller's global energy grid that he had as a response. And I wanted to end with the word, science now finds there can be ample for all, but only if the sovereign fences are completely removed, which would suggest that, yes, it's partly up to architects to deal with the energy crisis, but the main problem isn't architectural or technical. The ultimate problem is political and the degree of collaboration that can be mustered by political organizations. And therefore, the next proposal would be the architectural contribution would be this flag to this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you for explaining your vision, including the flag. It's an interesting thing that I would like to discuss in my country. I'm Italian, but so it's. We have the last speaker and architect, Julien Desmet from JDS Architects. Now the floor is yours.
I'm going to try this. The lazy version. Yeah. So, does it work? It's on. Oh yeah, okay. But it doesn't change here though. So maybe I'll just use that. So yeah, we've been looking at in a very kind of late notice at what was actually our approach to the issue of clean energy. Now it's gone again. Okay, thanks. Now I have it here. Yeah, but it doesn't shift. Was it also hard for you, Rainier? No. Is it just me? I mean, I am feeling a little weak, but not that weak. No. Okay. So the first thing is, of course, like the less you build, the better. Definitely an approach that we've been looking into is to try to avoid to build new. This has been sort of an awakening, maybe on the late. But so we've been looking at different projects about reusing buildings, and we're one of the sort of sad losers of the Citroën building with Rainier, actually, that to transform the Citroën buildings here in Brussels as the new canal project with Centre Pompidou. And yeah, that's definitely a project that I think is going to help the behavior towards working with existing structures. And the only thing that we proposed that was actually really new was a sort of like a high line type of approach on the roof, just to get more of the context and another view on the city that you can see here. But basically, like, one thing that is like an unexplored territory in many ways is the roof of our cities, and it's quite sort of shocking because, you know, the 5 points of architecture from Corbusier was written in 1926, and he talked about using the roof, and it hasn't been used that much. So there's a whole kind of opportunity there to work on, and we've done a little bit of work on that with this project, which is a very simple addition to an existing building in Copenhagen, where we also kind of combine the addition of 3 penthouses for the co-living community of this building, with their common garden, which is a place that they didn't have since the block was so tight. And then on a sort of maybe slightly bigger scale, and locally here in Europe, it could be interesting to discuss this idea of establishing a palace of global justice in Brussels, with the palace of justice that we don't have a clue what to do with. It's probably the biggest building. It was the biggest building in the world when it was built. It's probably still one of them. And so what we proposed was to actually use the building as a palace of justice, but that would be strictly dedicated to the question of the environment. So all the cases that have to do with environmental issues would be dealt with there. And it's a way to give back to a city where basically the Palace of Justice destroyed an entire neighborhood when it was built. And what we proposed also to add to it was basically a sort of new park, a park for Brussels that is maybe more three-dimensional, that would have amazing views to the city. So if you don't get to do this, then you build new, or you do something else with your life. But of course, like as it's been heavily discussed, we have to minimize energy. And basically, there's a way to minimize energy and resources that is related to what David said, the embodiment of the buildings related to the construction. And there's like sort of examples in the work that we've done that are kind of surprising. But like, for instance, if you take the ski jump of Oslo, which was designed and built for the World Championship 2011, that's then. And it's been called a lot of different names, like the Eiffel Tower, the Norwegian Eiffel Tower, or Long Chair for God, or the giant Chinese spoon. And the thing that we think about with the ski jump was actually the main task of it was to make it possible. And making it possible was basically to deal with a very tight budget and a very tight timeline. So we reduced you could say the carbon footprint of the building a third, and made it possible because we basically created the most extravagant part of it, which is the longest cantilever in the world, that allows to lighten the structure. So if anybody has kind of structural knowledge here, basically if you make a beam, a given beam with a given span, if you reduce the span, the cantilever that you get on the other side will actually lighten up the beam. And in the case of a building that is made out of steel only, that means a third of the steel was saved in this building, and also a third of the cost, but also a third or like more environmental impact that it could have on the land. And so that's kind of like the way we see this project. And it's called an iconic building, but what's the background of it has nothing to do with iconic. It's basically sort of nerdy guys like us just sitting down and trying to figure out a way to make it good. And this is how it sits in the fjord. Also, like another project that has been about creating capacity to reduce cost, and by every time you reduce cost, in my mind, you also reduce the use of resources. If something is expensive, there's a reason for it, and that's because you're buying resources. And this project is a housing project in Aarhus, sorry, and it was done entirely prefabricated, both on site and off site, and that was actually a way to make it possible, which is not something that you totally get when you see it, but it's actually a very efficient building. So there's also, of course, the use of the energy. And then here in Brussels, I don't know if we're the first ones, but we're definitely pioneers in the idea of creating passive regulations. And we had to go through that process by doing a house recently that we completed here in town, on the outskirts of Brussels, but still in Brussels. which is a private house. We don't do too many of those, but that's one of them. And I think what's interesting about the passive house or the passive building regulation is, of course, that it forces you to really improve the conditions that you're working under. But actually, like David said, it's also very it's narrowing down or like ruling issues that are maybe still left open and that need more reflection and more research before they become actual regulations. So this is a sort of very architect-friendly building, you could say, in many ways. It also had, for once, a better budget, which allowed us to do a house that is passive, but also quite interesting architecturally. The thing about the passive regulation is that you end up with buildings you don't want to live in many times. One of the things that I want to point out here is that one of the reasons why it was possible to have it that way is because it's embedded in the landscape. So like that approach to use earth and to use that sort of a natural protection level is what is possible is good to do. I don't know how much time I have, actually. So we've been working a lot with private clients, but also a lot with public clients. So how do you like mediate from these two almost opposite behaviors sometimes? And so we believe, of course, that the densification of the city is a necessity. But as you do that, it also is very important to focus on the densification of, or the expansion of public space and what we call the unbuilt, like in this project in Copenhagen. And that's an approach that you can do together with a programming so that you sort of add up different programs that will make the place, in fact, more desirable. And more desirable is, in fact, more environmental, because the more we desire things, the more we keep them, which is the key to sustainability, is to not destroy anything. And we've been working with different projects to reintroduce greenery. It was kind of mocked by Rainier as a typical OMA thing, but it's also like there's different ways to do it, and I think it's a good introduction to the city to have more vegetation. Obviously, it's also like ridiculous the way that it has become in any kind of competition. It's about that approach and almost only that. But we've done a sort of very small contribution to a Copenhagen building, which is a housing merged with a parking structure here on the right. And that has really sort of changed the condition of that sort of housing that typically is sort of very devoid of any vegetation. So we've been working on different projects here in Brussels to try to introduce production back into the city, and in order to, of course, like sort of reduce the cost of transportation and the distances and the energy use. And this is one of the projects that has unfortunately failed, but that I think was interesting to provide. It was a client that wanted to do a big housing development, and we introduced in that a series of production facilities to accompany the model. And then within the buildings themselves, of course, the more mixed programming you provide, the more sharing of resources you also give. So this is a project that we did in Lille that combines 3 totally different buildings, like a kindergarten, youth hostel, and a business incubator into one united building. It actually has a version of or like a homage to OMA's AMO's contribution to the European flag, or maybe just an update of it with all the states at the time as a facade. So it shares like a lot of its spaces in between these 3 buildings, like circulation, courtyards. And then maybe one thing that we've been really interested in developing and haven't managed so much because of the scale of it, but I think it's something that maybe Foster has been wanting to do as well, is the combination of architecture and infrastructure. We've attempted to do some of it with the project I showed you earlier, the mountain in Copenhagen, where we're combining programs that were not meant to be on the same spot in the master plan, but we actually sort of convinced the city to add or to change the affectation of the site in order to create a mix of a sort of parking, more infrastructural structure, and housing with the mountain. And what happened is basically sort of that you share resources in the build environment, so that one client is sort of like sitting down and paying for one thing, and the other one uses some of it to rise its own project. And maybe to end, like I just sort of show a project that we're currently developing. It's under building permit in Charleroi. It's a Congress palace, so it's like this kind of building that's a grand gesture building, you know, that you could imagine is very political as well. And what we try to do, first what we analyze is that the Congress Palace is actually a place that doesn't live so much as far as the city goes, because it's only event-based, so it just has these moments, these bursts of activity, and then it sort of dies out. And so what we try to do is to combine with that a series of public activities that would allow for the place to be fully active all year round. And then we won the competition, and now we are getting the building permit for it. And so, of course, the last thing is to go off grid. But we're working on a project about that, an island, since we talked about islands. But unfortunately, we're a little too early in the process because we can't talk about it. So I'll see you there.
Thank you. So I first would like to invite the panelists to be all on stage. I'm told that we can be here until 2:40, so this gives me the opportunity to show you a few slides also from my part, to put, yeah, as you wish, to put this a little bit in context why it is really important and urgent. And then we can launch. I give immediately the floor to all the others. Can I have my slides? I can, I can't, I can, maybe. Maybe. Anyway, just to start. By already today, 50% roughly in the world of population lives in cities. And by 2050, it will be more than 70%. Some say 75%. It's a huge number. And this, excellent. So this is, it's different shares in different parts of the world. In the OECD countries, it can be up to 80%, less, of course, in India and Africa. But this opens a big, big challenge in many places. Second part, by 2050, 7 billion out of 9 billion people will be in solar-rich countries. This means the opportunity for solar energy, but also means that the cooling needs will be much higher than today. Already today, the cooling electricity demand is 10% of total electricity demand in the world. It's already huge, but it's going to triple if we don't do anything. If we don't follow what they just said, which is unfortunately the general trend, then we go up by factor 3. Now, this can be cut by half, by 2/3, with more efficient air conditioning systems and all devices. This is in principle easy, and much better buildings like we just saw. Now, nobody of you spoke too much about mobility. We are hinging on a revolution of mobility, in particular in cities, be it public transport or private transport. Electric vehicles will be somehow between 125 million and 250 million electric vehicles in the world by 2030. This is only 12 years from now. All these will need charging stations, and we believe it will be slow charging stations, despite what Tesla thinks, and Elon Musk, we believe something else. So the question here, where will the architects and the planners build these slow chargers, at work or in the house? Now, the second thing, the biggest part is not electricity, but it's actually heat. We lose a lot of heat from data centers. This was also not touched at all. Can we combine this, or in metros, in public infrastructure, can we recover that heat and put it in district heating, and can we also use district cooling? We saw very nice projects of new cities, but what do we do in an existing city? And on this, I stop recalling what Dominique Ristori said. For Europe, the real challenge is the restoration of the existing building stocks. New buildings, that's fine, but it's only a low minority of the issue. So based on just these few slides, I would have a lot of questions already for you, but I open here the floor. Do we have microphones in the room? Yes, do we have? So please introduce yourself very, very briefly and be concise to give our panelists the time to respond. One here, the gentleman here, and then the second there. So here, please.
Hello, Philippe Mosley from the European Commission Executive Agency for SMEs. My question is about cost and money. We heard from Julien de Smet about the passive house that was expensive. The question is, with the deadline approaching now where every new building in Europe is going to be a nearly zero energy building, is the cost of energy efficient buildings a problem?
Who wants to take that?
I mean, to start with, it was expensive not because it was passive. It was expensive because it had a good budget. You know, it was expensive because the client wanted it to be. It was more like, you know, for once we have a client that actually wants to spend some money. But passive, I mean, it's a little more expensive, but it's not much compared to, you know, traditional. But it's a lot more demanding, though. What I think is more problematic with the standard is that it leads to architectures that are maybe not desirable. And that is, I think, environmentally a huge problem, because if something is not, you know, desired, it will end up being taken down. I mean, it would not be lived well, and then people will take it down eventually, which is the biggest environmental cost, in fact, is to rebuild something from something that was already built. So, no, I think it's not the cost of it that's the real problem. It's too regulated too early.
Any other opinions? Brian?
Yeah, since recently, I refuse to talk about the cost of buildings for a very simple reason, that buildings have an economy. The cost of building is one part of that economy. The other part of the building's economy is their trade value. Buildings are built to be sold. I mean, we all think buildings are built to be used. Buildings are built to be sold for more than they were bought, and then resold for more than they were bought. And if you look at the astronomical profits that are made from real estate, if you look at the size of the economy, of the money that goes around in real estate, I mean, architects' budgets, even if you would triple them, are peanuts. It is so curiously that in the context of our profession, we only talk about cost cutting, you know, putting our head in a strop, and we have almost as architects zero expertise and zero knowledge of how much money these buildings make after we're gone. Dubai launders $44 billion of black money annually in real estate profits. Their massive amounts of money simply re-emerge as clean profits into the system. I think here again, it's when you just only focus on architecture, and that was the gist of my presentation, you look at a footnote under a microscope hoping it will turn into a novel, and the vast story is, I think, economical and political there, even if it would cost 3 times the amount of money to make ecologically sound buildings. At the scale of the economy, that's still a negligible cost. The problem is that the public sector no longer decides over that money.
I think there's another add-on with it, which is I think there's no value in carbon, and all the push, particularly with the Paris Agreement, is trying to reduce carbon, obviously for the reasons that we all know, but it has no monetary value, and therefore we're living in an economy that has got nothing to do with saving carbon whatsoever. It's an oil-based world that we live in. We transport materials all over the world from A to Z. I think there's a whole massive interconnected industry that responds to buildings, that looks for the cheapest wherever it can find it. And therefore, it's a kind of a false question to say, will they be more expensive? Because the simple answer is yes, they will, because we'll be trying to do it in an economy that's not built for it.
Sorry, but before we go forward, let everybody know that you can also write questions connecting to slido.com, and you can write the question. They will be filtered, administered, and then maybe we can pass. But in the meantime, can I challenge you a little bit? Because I'm sympathetic with his question. If you say the cost is not a problem, the second is compared to the astronomical profits, it's peanuts. You have said another thing. Why it doesn't happen? Why are we not flooded with much better projects? Where is the bottleneck? Because somewhere there is a bottleneck. You put it in such a way we don't have a carbon price. So to you, I would ask, imagine we had a carbon price. Would this solve everything?
I don't know, it's a brave man that says it'll solve everything. I think it would actually reinterpret what you would spend on a building. I mean, I think building on what you were saying earlier on, you know, the huge cost, if you look at the lifetime of a building, you know, particularly a building that you would work in, the massive cost is people. That's the biggest cost. And how much is invested in terms of the building in the first place, how much you have to spend to run it, is a tiny fraction of what is going to be spent in the overall lifetime of that project. So I think that if we get in our mindset the chance to think about that a bit more, to think about the big picture, and therefore not when we demolish you lose all that embodied carbon. So let's design something or restore new existing buildings, of course. We have to do that because of all the cities we live in. But if you do something new, make it flexible for change. And that's an ambition. Then you meet the real world of the people that build stuff. 50% of those, that's a wrong equation. In my head, 50% of the kind of projects that maybe we get involved with are built with people who have borrowed money, a huge amount of money. They're very brave people. I'd never be brave enough to do that. And they actually build. And the motive behind it is finance, is money. They've got to get it back. And you can understand why. They borrowed a huge amount. You've got to be able to get it back quick. So if you get it back quick, your interest in the long term isn't there. And that is the world.
Picking up on that, the restoration of existing buildings, of course, is good. And then you restore them, they become more energy efficient. It's no rocket science, but there is an impetus in our financial system, particularly on cities with escalating land prices, to actually demolish buildings and build bigger buildings in their place. So, you know, restore existing buildings. It all sounds very noble and very good, but I think when you leave a vast incentive that is somewhere else in the economic system unaddressed, it's going to be carrying water to the sea, I believe is the English expression. And that's the problem I have. I mean, I love looking at architecture, because it partly means we can talk about ourselves. But there is a real problem with looking at architecture in isolation.
So what's your reaction to that? If it's a problem you have?
What problem? I don't think it's a problem I have. I think that well, if there is an economic incentive to demolish buildings, and at the same time you're talking about that restoring buildings is the most important part, you know, when the economy dictates that those buildings get demolished, then there is nothing to restore. So in short, my problem is then that you get advised a policy direction and a solution which is unimplementable before you've even started.
Yeah, but
So
screw the
then-
policy. I mean, what do you propose to do?
Well, I would propose a political solution where actually land speculation inside cities would be vastly curtailed, because that will have a way bigger impact than anything an architect can do. But I'm not a politician, but
So
I have a few ideas on the subject.
It's the opposite of what Schumacher is talking about, right?
It's generally, Schumacher is a wonderful guy, because you just have to look at what he says, take the opposite direction, and you're a long way in an ethically good direction.
Yeah, I know.
So it's a
I
huge
completely agree on that. Okay.
Julian, another comment? What would you do? Because I heard you saying too regulated too soon, then wrong financing system, wrong economy. These are astronomical endeavors. So in practice, what could we do? Or what would you ask politicians, policymakers to do in practice?
And the problem gets more complex when you look beyond Europe. Because there's one thing is that here it's almost comfortable to talk because, you know, as it's been stretched overly, it's about the European Union, but it's like actually the problem is much bigger, and so we don't really have a way to influence that.
But even in Europe, what do you do?
No,
I would say what I heard here is also true for Europe.
No, it is. But I mean, what Rainier says is true. That in Europe, you could potentially, like, you know, regulate the market better.
Okay. The gentleman there, then the lady here, and we have some questions lining up.
Thank you. My name is Ray Schonfeld. My question goes back to one of the very first slides of David Nelson at the beginning of this afternoon. The general question is, how good is the measurement toolbox available to architects to measure the results of their work on energy performance? And if I can link that to David's slides, there was a very interesting slide, one of very many interesting slides this afternoon. There was a slide you put up which compared various certification schemes around the world, and you said that none of them actually dealt with the totality of the impact on the environment. You made a distinction between operational emissions and embodied emissions. You then went on to make a distinction between what the architects themselves can do and then the broader context of urban planning. So when you take all that together, what does it leave us with? How good is the measurement toolbox? What more needs to be done? There are things that have not been measured, that mentioned this afternoon, like standards for measuring carbon footprints. I don't know if that comes into the equation. How good is the toolbox, and what better tools are needed in order to measure the impact of the work that you're describing this afternoon?
This is a good question, and I would add a little bit an annex. What are the verification and tools? Because we are in a transitional office with a green label, and it's enough to be there in an afternoon of summer to understand that there's something wrong with this label. So,
well, I think the labels are labels, as you call them, the kind of measurement systems of. I was trying to remember back before there was a measurement system. What was it like before LEED? And BREEAM and all the other things around the world. But I mean, since they've been around, they have been, if you look at how they're constructed, there are panels of people who actually are consulted on, you know, from within the industry and from elsewhere, on how those, what should be the priorities and how does it work through. And I think the people who have evolved those systems work in the real world of construction and building things and transportation. And therefore, there's a consensus view, and they have to reach a consensus view in order to change the standards. So when we presented our findings to one of the representatives for LEED, they recognized that when they do upgrade to the next level, they're going to have to make 2 jumps this time. What they'll do is they'll take the gold, platinum, you know, and move it up. So there'll be the same designation, but it will actually have a higher performance. But it'll take 5 years, or 3 to 5 years, because they've got to get a consensus view. I think what's interesting now, Europe leads, France in particular. And I'm just finding out about this, so I'm not a great expert on it, but the E+, C- regulations that are being, well, not regulations, but guidance that is being developed in France right now, it will take into account the issues of embodied energy and will bring those two together. And that's scheduled to be law by 2020. Now, a lot of things can trip that up, but it has the promise of being something which is far more onerous, if you like, compared with what we have today, but gives some guidance if you look into the way that's being built. But that's in transition. So being an optimist, I'm hoping that leads somewhere that we can all have a new platform to work from.
I understand there is a connected question.
Yeah, that's why thank you very much. I'm Anita Derjanec, Managing Director of REIVA, which is an association of building services engineers, designers. So I just wanted to bring in the perspective this European regulatory aspect, because I didn't have to mention the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive or the national building codes. So there are some also European or national, in Europe, national requirements on the energy performance of buildings, and how much you are aware of. What do you think about their effectiveness compared to the commercial labeling systems or labeling schemes that are available? And I have a second one as well. Still in Europe, I think we face the problem of the existing building stock. So it's not the big projects, of course, it's easy to demolish or make new greenfield investments. But still, there is a huge amount of buildings in Europe that should be refurbished and hopefully improved in terms of energy and the comfort performance levels. So how you tackle these problems? What do you think about from regulatory and the architectural point of view? Thank you.
Who wants to take this?
Yeah, I mean, the truth is that we don't, like, I think that you don't get to, these are conditions where the architect is almost not called ever. So, right? I mean, you don't really often get a commission of a building owner that says, you know, I got an issue with my building.
Necessarily. So if you want to refurbish the Palais de Justice, it will need an architect. So.
No, of course. Yeah, but that's like... So in that way, what's the question really about? What's the technical solution?
Are you aware, because nobody mentioned, so are you aware that there are certain European legislation and codes, and whether you tackle it anyhow? And still, if you come back to the existing buildings question, do you have any suggestions how to achieve their performance improvements?
I think the existing legislation to improve it would be to give it greater power and greater authority on the more everyday systems that I was describing here. You really, unless a government or a mayor of a city or an interested client really wants to do something different, tackle the problem, only then will those standards be adopted. And nobody's interested. It costs a lot of money to get certification on any of those things. It's a very expensive process. So any commercial developer who doesn't have to do it, or even anybody, you, if nobody's making it a physical law, then well, why bother? Yeah. And I think that's half the problem.
But in my experience, I mean, with commercial clients, you talk about these things, and you can be good, you can be excellent, you can be outstanding, you can be all those sort of things. And it's very interesting, I mean, because of course you would assume that you would want your building to be as good, outstanding, or whatever as possible. But it's a very educated, calculated guess. Let's go for above average. I don't think that category exists in LEED because it's too cynical. But let's go for good. Let's not go for excellent.
It's probably
Or let's go for excellence. Let's not go for outstanding. But it's invariably, let's go for something other than the best possible thing, because that will allow us to be perceived as ecologically responsible and at the same time not cost too much money. And I think, and legislation in that sense is a very, very powerful instrument, I think, because it is the only thing powerful enough against the impetus of the financial system, which dictates, spending as little money for the best possible perception to counter it aggressively. That an obligation to go for the best that is at the moment technologically possible, because otherwise it becomes very often in practice, in my practice, because it is an issue, and people care enough not to be perceived as bastards, etc. But it would be nice if the ambition, was simply higher.
I think what was shocking for our board when we actually presented that information was that, you have to understand, a lot of people believe that if they achieve LEED Platinum or BREEAM Outstanding, they've done their bit for the planet. What the Paris Agreement shows when you do the maths is you haven't done anything. I'm afraid you just lost most of Bangladesh at the end of the century, or whatever it is, the Maldives went a long while ago. What else happens with floods and everything else that comes with it? It is all predicted. I think the comfort zone we've all had, and our clients have all had, has been the structuring of those disciplines. If I can achieve that, then I've solved everything. And the shocking thing is, no, you've not.
Can I ask you, just expanding 1 second, what is your negotiation power with clients? Have you experienced that you get a client who wants to get, let's say, excellent, and you convince them to be outstanding?
Well, you have more power than we do, I think.
Well, I don't think the architect, Norman often says, the architect doesn't have any power.
Okay.
All you have is influence. I think that the real challenge is to be able to communicate.
Okay.
And the more technical the issues become, the harder it becomes to communicate. I think if we can find ways that we can get the message over to people, then you hope that you can appeal to their intellect. Do you really want your grandchildren to look back at you and actually say, at the end of this century, they had a chance to do something and they didn't even try? Is that what you want? Or is that sort of...
It's rhetoric I rarely apply, I have to say. It also doesn't work in Dutch when you take it down that vein. It's although I endorse absolutely everything you say, I don't know how. Particularly, it also depends where you sprout that rhetoric, and certain countries are more susceptible. But what strangely the power or influence you have is that. Most buildings still come around as the result of a triangulation between the architect, the private client in most of the cases, and the public sector that needs to grant approval. And somehow a lot of clients still rely on architects to persuade the public sector that they're actually doing something responsible, and you can somehow translate the influence and the credit you are apparently giving of a responsible action back to your clients to say, but they'll never agree to that. They'll never agree to that. And then, you can then also, sorry.
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah.
We're just...
out of time.
Not out.
No.
Running short.
So
you have also an opinion on this? Did you convince your clients to do something much better?
I actually think that, if you play their game, you can convince them of... if you can convince them that you will... Like if they're, a developer type of client, if you can convince them that they will make a better profit, then you can get them to go somewhere. Which, includes the environmental issue. So,
let me shift to one of these three. I would be interested in the first. Can Europe be a leader in green architecture, or do you see it happen in the greenfields and emerging countries? Julien said, well, the problem is much bigger in other countries, but in other countries, sometimes we also see that then they run much faster than us. So what do you think? Will Europe be a leader, or in 5 years from now, we discover again we are laggards?
Well, I think Europe should be a leader in making sure that everybody's on board. instead of talking about Europe being the leader of the environment revolution, it won't matter if it doesn't apply to everyone. So, I mean, we need to work with people instead of trying to profile ourselves as better than them, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think a lot of the downfall of the status of Europe globally has been the excessive amount of finger pointing and presumed moral superiority of Europeans in the face of others who have completely different challenges. And we hold them accountable to our own luxurious standards. I think that's partially what explains the demise of Europe. But I simply wonder whether being a leader in green architecture and being a leader for the green cause are simply two and the same things, or whether they're actually slightly different things. Because with green architecture, I would say probably when it comes to the green cause, I think it's a whole lot more problematic.
David?
I think I'd quite like to go to a talk here where somebody's talking about what they're doing in relation to the Paris Agreement in agriculture or in industry or power distribution. Because I think the one thing that the hope that the Paris Agreement actually put out was the fact that it's everybody. Everybody, in whatever you're doing, in whatever industry, we've all got to do that. And, you know, architects play a significant part, sure, but we don't grow tomatoes.
Okay, we could continue, but I'm afraid we have to stop because otherwise we are ejected out of the room. Let me resume just 3 things that hit my attention just to conclude. First, on the upside, I really thank you for some of these visionary projections and outlook that you showed. Definitely the solutions are there. This is not a technology issue, nor a materials, nor a resource issue. It's a question of cultural change and behavior and business and finance and everything. On the downside, I see it's still a huge challenge to go from fantastic example to really scaling it up. So far, we have managed this only in renewable utility scale and nothing else. All the rest is lagging behind. This is a huge challenge, which is well beyond just the architects. And this leads me to the third point. The next time we do a workshop, or us, or you, the European Commission, we don't just invite the architects, we invite their clients as well. And we also invite the banks that are financing, because probably the solution is in a stick and carrot from policymakers all over the supply chain, starting with the banks. So if the banks have financed something which is unsustainable, to some extent they have to be accountable. Your clients as well. And that's the only way, in my opinion, to make it really a scale up. I hope this will happen. It could be happen. The finance world is moving. It's not static, not at all. There will be an interesting meeting in Paris next week on that. So I want to conclude on this, but please join me in applauding our fantastic panelists today.
Great. Good.